A single mom, helping an elderly man who had fallen, never expected he was a lonely billionaire with no family, who would change her world forever. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. Where in the world are you? Watching from the rain fell in a cold, persistent drizzle, the kind that seeps into the seams of your coat and settles in your bones like a dull ache. Clara Vega felt it in her shoulders as she hurried down the slick sidewalk, one hand gripping her son's small, mittened one, the other clutching a grocery bag, threatening to give way. The streetlights had just begun to flicker on, casting a watery yellow glow on the pavement that mirrored the faded hope in her chest. It had been another long day. A double shift at the diner, where the smell of stale coffee and burnt grease clung to her clothes long after she clocked out. Now all she wanted was the warmth of their small apartment, the sound of Leo's laughter, and a single moment where the weight of it all didn't feel like it was pressing her into the concrete ahead. An old man stumbled his cane, skittering across the wet ground with a sharp clatter. He went down, not with a loud cry, but with a quiet, defeated slump like a building. Surrendering to gravity, people glanced, then looked away their own hurried lives, pulling them forward like a current. But Clara stopped her heart, giving a sharp lurch that had nothing to do with her own exhaustion and everything to do with the quiet finality of his fall. "Stay here, honey," she said to Leo, her voice calm. Despite the sudden knot in her throat, she let go of his hand and rushed forward, kneeling beside the man whose face was pale and etched with pain against the gray backdrop of the evening. "Sir, are you okay?" He looked up, his eyes, a startlingly clear blue, clouded with confusion and a flicker of shame. He was dressed in a simple wool coat worn at the cuffs and a tweed cap that had tumbled into a nearby puddle. "I'm fine," he rasped, trying to push himself up with a trembling hand. But his legs wouldn't cooperate. Clara gently placed a hand on his arm. "Easy now, let me help." She slid one arm under his back, her muscles straining against his surprising weight. He was thin but dense. Like old wood, he smelled faintly of rain. And something else, something like dusty books and quiet rooms together. They managed to get him to a seated position, his breath coming in shallow bursts. "Thank you," he muttered, his pride warring with his gratitude. Clara could see it in the tight set of his jaw, in the way he refused to fully lean on her. She looked around for a place to rest and saw a small, well-kept brownstone just a few feet away, its windows dark, save for a single lamp glowing in what looked like a living room. "Do you live nearby?" she asked. He nodded toward the brownstone. "Right there." With Leo watching from a safe distance, his small face a mixture of worry and curiosity, Clara helped the man to his feet and slowly guided him up the short flight of stairs. His gait was unsteady, but he refused to be carried. His dignity, a fragile shield against the evening's indignity inside the house, was silent and smelled of lemon polish and old paper. It was meticulously clean, but held the kind of stillness that spoke of a life lived alone. She helped him to a large armchair by the window, where he sank into the cushions with a weary sigh. "Can I get you anything?" Clara asked, hovering by the door. "A glass of water. Maybe call someone." He shook his head. "No one to call." The words were simple, but they landed with the weight of a biography. Clara nodded and went to the kitchen, finding a glass and filling it from the batter tap. When she returned, he was staring out at the rain-streaked street, his expression unreadable. She handed him the water, his fingers brushing hers as he took it. The touch was brief, but it felt like a current passing between two solitary islands. "I should pay you for your trouble," he said, reaching for a wallet on the small table beside him. Clara held up a hand instinctively. "No, please don't," she said, her voice firm but gentle. "It's not trouble seeing someone fall, and not stopping that's trouble." He looked at her, then really looked at her, his gaze sharp and assessing. He saw the weariness in her eyes, the frayed edge of her coat, the determined set of her chin. She wasn't looking for a reward, she was just a person who had chosen to be kind in a world that often wasn't. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "Clara," she replied. "And that's my son Leo." She glanced back at the doorway, where Leo was peeking in his curiosity. Finally, winning out over his shyness, the old man nodded slowly. "Arthur," he said. "Arthur Vance." He didn't offer a handshake or a smile. Just a name and a silence that felt like a closed door. Clara knew it was her cue to leave. She had groceries, to put away a child, to feed a life that didn't pause for fallen strangers. But as she turned to go, she couldn't shake the image of his eyes, the clost one assaget to ever. Profound loneliness she'd seen there. A loneliness she recognized because she felt it in her own quiet moments after Leo was asleep and the city hummed its indifferent lullaby outside her window. "If you need anything," she said, pausing at the door. "I work at the diner down the street, just ask for Clara." He just nodded, watching her go as the door clicked shut. Arthur Vance was left alone again, in the silence of his immaculate house. The only difference was that this time, the silence felt a little less complete. The door clicked shut, plunging the hallway back into its familiar dimness. Arthur remained in the armchair, the glass of water still cool in his trembling hand. He listened to the faint sound of their footsteps retreating down the path, the mother's steady stride, and the child's lighter, quicker ones, until they were swallowed by the sound of the rain. It had been years since a stranger had crossed his threshold. Not a delivery person, not a contractor, not a lawyer with a briefcase full of papers that only served to remind him of how much he had and how little it mattered. He looked around the room, his gaze tracing the lines of the mahogany bookshelf filled with first editions. He'd never read the hand-knotted rug he'd bought at an auction in Istanbul, the single abstract painting on the wall that was worth more than the entire block. It was a curated life, a museum of success, and it was as empty as a tomb. He had built an empire from nothing, turning a small textile company into a global conglomerate. He had outsmarted competitors, acquired rivals, and amassed a fortune that could last 10 lifetimes. But in the process, he had shed everything else. His wife, who had tired of his relentless ambition, had left him decades ago. His partners had become adversaries. His friends had faded into Christmas cards and eventually nothing at all. Now he was just Arthur Vance, a name that echoed in boardrooms. He no longer visited a phantom who lived behind a fortress of wealth and solitude. He had everything a man could want and nothing a person could need. This woman, Clara, she hadn't looked at him with the deference he was used to, or the pity he despised. She had looked at him like he was just a man who had fallen. She had offered help without calculation, her kindness a small, steady flame in the cold drizzle of his existence. He took a slow sip of the water. It tasted clean and simple. He thought of the boy Leo, his wide, curious eyes peeking around the doorframe, unafraid and unburdened by the weight of a name he didn't know. Arthur set the glass down on the polished side table, the silence of bursons of Daoud Bo. The house pressed in on him again, but this time it wasn't just empty, it was heavy with the echo of a kindness he hadn't realized he'd been starving for. He didn't know if he would see her again. He didn't know if he wanted to. Letting someone in, even for a moment, was a risk, a breach in the carefully constructed walls he'd spent a lifetime building. But as he stared out the window at the rain-slicked street, he found himself hoping she'd meant what she said. That if he needed anything, he could just ask. It was a foolish thought, a dangerous one, but it was the first hopeful thought he'd had in a very long time back in their own small apartment. The world felt both safer and more precarious. Scent of wet wool and the day's fatigue hung in the air, but the warmth from the rattling radiator offered a fragile comfort. Clara moved through their tiny kitchen with an economy of motion born from years of practice unpacking the radiator, slightly. Damp groceries. While Leo chattered away at the small Formica table, his crayon flying across a piece of scrap paper, he was drawing a man with a cane and a very crooked hat. "Was that man okay, Mom?" Leo asked, without looking up from his masterpiece. Clara paused, her hands deep in a bag of potatoes. "I think so, honey. He just needed a little help." Leo nodded thoughtfully. "He looked sad." Clara's heart gave a small pang. "He's right, the boy had a way of seeing things clearly." Cutting through the noise to the quiet truth of a moment, Arthur Vance's sadness had been palpable, a loneliness so profound it seemed to have its own gravity. "Maybe he's just lonely," she said softly. More to herself than to her son, she thought about her own life, the constant hustle, the bills that always seemed to arrive faster than the paychecks, the ache in her feet at the end of a shift. She was tired, bone-tired, but she wasn't lonely. Not really. She had Leo, her small, fierce son, who lit up every corner of her world. He was the reason for the struggle, but he was also the reason the struggle was worth it. She finished putting the food away, the fridge looking slightly less barren than it had an hour ago. She began to make dinner, a simple pasta with a sauce she'd cobbled together from canned tomatoes and a few wilting herbs. As she stirred the pot, the image of Arthur's house came back to her, so clean, so quiet, so still. It was the opposite of their own chaotic, loving space where toys lived under the couch. And Leo's artwork was taped to every available surface. His home had felt like a place where no one ever dropped crumbs or spilled juice or laughed too loudly. She wondered what he was doing now, sitting alone in that big chair, probably staring out at the rain. She found herself worrying about him. Had he eaten? Did he have anyone to check on him? It was a foolish thing to worry about a stranger's well-being when her own was so uncertain, but she couldn't help it. Her mother had always said that kindness was a muscle. The more you used it, the stronger it got, and Clara's had been exercised to the point of exhaustion. But it had never failed her. Later that night, after Leo was tucked into his bed, a small, stuffed dragon clutched in his arms. Clara sat by the window, watching the rain trace paths down the glass. She thought about Arthur's offer to pay her the crisp way. He'd said it as if it were the only currency he knew how to offer. She was glad she had refused money, would have turned it into a transaction. A service rendered it would have erased the simple human connection of the moment. A connection, she realized, she had needed just as much as he had the next day, dawned gray and damp, the kind of morning that made staying in bed feel like an act of rebellion. But for Clara, there was no such luxury. The alarm clock buzzed at 5 a.m. A cruel reminder that the world didn't wait. She moved through her morning routine with a practiced weariness, making Leo's lunch, packing his backpack, leaving a note on the table beside his cereal, all before the sun had even considered making an appearance at the diner. The morning rush was a blur of controlled chaos. Plates, clattered coffee, sloshed orders were shouted, and Clara moved through it all like a dancer in a storm. Her smile practiced her movements efficient. She refilled coffee cups, wiped down sticky tables, and listened to the familiar complaints and pleasantries of her regulars, but her mind kept drifting back to the quiet brownstone a few blocks away. She wondered if Arthur was up, if he'd had breakfast, if he was still sore from his fall, around 10 a.m. During a rare lull, her boss Marty, a man whose temperament was as greasy as the bacon on his grill, grumbled from behind the counter, "Hey Clara, you got a phone call." Clara froze. Customers didn't call her here. "Who is it?" she asked her. Stomach tightening. Marty shrugged. "Some old guy didn't leave a name. Just said he wanted to know what the soup of the day was." Clara's heart skipped a beat. She took the receiver, her hand trembling slightly. "Diner. This is Clara," she said, her voice a little breathless. "Hello, Clara. It's Arthur Vance." His voice was a low rumble on the other end, steady and formal. "I was just calling to, I hope this isn't an imposition." Clara's smile was instant. and genuine, "No, not at all, Mr. Vance. The soup is tomato basil today." There was a pause on the other end. "Tomato basil," he repeated, as if the words were foreign. "Is it any good?" Clara laughed softly. "It's my recipe. It's the best thing we have." Another pause then. "I see. Well, thank you for the information." And with that, he hung up. Clara stood there for a moment, the dial tone buzzing in her ear. She didn't know why he had called. Maybe it was just an excuse, a way to break the silence of his own home. But it felt like more than that. It felt like a small, fragile bridge being extended across the distance between their two worlds. That afternoon, when her shift ended, she did something she hadn't planned to. She ladled a generous portion of bridge, the tomato basil soup, into a container, packed it in a paper bag with a few crackers and a napkin, and walked the 3 blocks to Arthur's house. She told herself it was just neighborly kindness. A simple gesture, but deep down she knew it was something more. She was answering a question he hadn't known how to ask. The rain had stopped, but the air was still heavy with a damp chill. As Clara stood on Arthur's doorstep, the paper bag warm in her hands, she hesitated for a moment, her knuckles hovering over the solid wood of the door. What was she even doing here, forcing her way into the life of a man who had made it clear he preferred to be alone? He had called about the soup, yes, but that didn't necessarily mean he wanted her to bring it to him. Maybe it had just been a moment of curiosity, a fleeting impulse. She was probably overstepping, crossing a boundary he had spent years carefully constructing, but then she thought of Leo's words. He looked sad, and the thought of Arthur sitting alone in that quiet house, eating something from a can or nothing at all, spurred her into action. She knocked softly, the sound absorbed by the heavy door. For a long moment there was nothing but silence. She was about to turn away, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment, when she heard the faint sound of a bolt being drawn. The door opened a few inches, and Arthur peered out. His face was ashen, and he looked even more tired than the day before. "Clara," he said, his voice rough with disuse. "I'm sorry to bother you, Mr. Vance," she said, holding up the bag. "I was just on my way home, and I had some extra soup. I thought you might like some." He stared at the bag, then at her, his expression unreadable. He didn't move to open the door further, and Clara's heart sank. She had been right. This was a mistake. "It's tomato basil," she added weakly. A foolish smile plastered on her face. Arthur's gaze flickered, and for the first time, she saw something other than loneliness in his eyes, a flicker of conflict. Of surprise, then, with a slow creak, he opened the door wider. "Come in," he said. Stepping aside, the inside of the house was just as she remembered, too immaculate and still. But today, it felt less like a museum and more like a waiting room. She followed him into the kitchen, a space of gleaming steel and dark wood that looked like it had never seen a spilled ingredient or a dirty dish. He gestured to the polished granite countertop, and she set the bag down, feeling clumsy and out of place in her worn coat and scuffed boots. "You didn't have to do this," he said, his back to her, as he took 2 bowls from a cabinet. His movements were stiff, formal. "I know," she replied, watching him, "but I wanted to." He didn't respond, just opened the container and poured the thick red soup into the bowls. The rich aroma of basil and tomato filled the sterile air, a stark contrast to the room's cold silence. He handed her a bowl and a spoon, and gestured to the small table in the corner, a table that looked like it hadn't been used for years. They sat in silence. For a few moments, the only sound, the soft clinking of their spoons against ceramic. The soup was warm and comforting, a small piece of her world brought into his. Clara watched him as he ate. He took small, deliberate bites, his gaze fixed on the bowl. She wondered what he was thinking, if he was annoyed by her intrusion, or if some small part of him was grateful for the company. Finally, he set his spoon down and looked at her. "It's good," he said, his voice quiet. "Thank you." Those two words hung in the air, a fragile peace offering, a small crack in the fortress he had built around himself. Clara smiled, a real smile this time. "You're welcome, Mr. Vance," she said. And for the first time she felt like maybe she hadn't made a mistake after all. They finished their soup in a comfortable silence that felt less like a void and more like a shared space. Clara found herself relaxing her shoulders unknotting. For the first time all day, Arthur seemed to soften too. The hard lines around his mouth eased, and he no longer looked at her with the guarded suspicion of a man expecting to be taken advantage of when they were done. He took their bowls to the sink and began to rinse them with a meticulous care that suggested he wasn't used to having guests. "You have a nice home," Clara said, looking around the kitchen. Again, it was a stark contrast to her own. Cluttered and lived in space. "It's a house," he replied, without turning around. "I'm not sure it's a home." Clara didn't know what to say to that, so she stayed quiet. She noticed a small framed photo on a shelf near the window, half hidden behind a stack of mail. It was an old black-and-white picture of a young woman with a radiant smile, her hair styled in the fashion of a bygone era. "Was that your wife?" she asked softly. Arthur paused, his hands still in the water. He didn't answer for a long moment, and Clara worried she had overstepped again. "Yes," he finally said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't hide. "Her name was Eleanor. She loved to cook. This kitchen was her domain." He turned the water off and dried his hands on a pristine towel, his eyes distant, as if he were seeing a ghost. "She would have liked your soup." Clara's heart ached for him, for the story held in that one small sentence. She stood up, feeling like it was time to leave before she intruded any further. "I should get going," she said. "Leo will be waiting." Arthur nodded and walked her to the door. "Thank you again, Clara," he said, as he opened it. "For the soup." "Any time," she replied. Turning to go, "Clara," he called after her. She stopped and looked back at him. "If you ever have more of that soup," he hesitated, his pride warring with a need he was only just beginning to acknowledge, "I would not be opposed to another visit." Clara smiled, a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the soup. "I'll keep that in mind," she said. As she walked away, she felt his eyes on her, but this time it didn't feel like an assessment. It felt like a quiet plea, a silent admission that maybe, just maybe, he didn't want to be alone. After all, she didn't know what this strange connection was, or where it was going, but for the first time she felt a flicker of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Hope, not just for him but for herself too. The days that followed settled into a new and unexpected rhythm. Clara would finish her shift at the diner, often tired and sore, but she'd find herself walking the extra 3 blocks to Arthur's brownstone. Sometimes she brought food, a container of stew, a slice of apple pie. She'd saved from her own meager portion. Other times she brought nothing but her presence. They would sit in his quiet living room, he in his armchair, she on the edge of the sofa, and they would talk, not about anything important at first, just the weather, the news, the antics of her regulars at the diner, but slowly, bit by bit, the walls began to come down. She learned that he had grown up poor, the son of immigrants who had worked themselves to the bone. He had started his business with a small loan and a relentless drive to prove he was worth more than the world had told him he was. He spoke of his late wife Eleanor with a mixture of reverence and regret, admitting he had been so focused on building his empire that he had often failed to appreciate the home she had built for him. Clara, in turn, told him about her own struggles, about raising Leo on her own after his father had walked out when he was just a baby. She spoke of her dreams, the ones she had packed away, like old clothes, a dream of opening her own small bakery, a place filled with the scent of fresh bread and the sound of laughter. Arthur was a dado Surprisingly good listener, he didn't offer advice or pity, just a quiet, attentive presence that made her feel seen in a way she hadn't been in years. Leo often came with her on these visits. He was the bridge between their two worlds. Unfazed by Arthur's wealth, which he didn't know about, and unbothered by his initial gruffness, he would sit on the floor with his coloring books or play with the intricate model ship on the mantel. A ship Arthur revealed he had built with his own father as a boy. Leo would ask Arthur questions that no one else dared to. "Mr. Art, why don't you have any pictures of kids? Or, don't you get bored in this big, quiet house?" Arthur would answer with a surprising honesty, telling him that he had never had children, and that yes, sometimes the house was very boring. Their friendship was an unlikely tapestry, woven from threads of loneliness, kindness, and a shared understanding of what it meant to be adrift in the world. For Clara, it was a respite, a moment of calm in her chaotic life. For Arthur, it was a lifeline, a connection to a world he had long since forgotten how to be a part of. He began to smile more, a real smile, that reached his clear blue eyes, and the house itself seemed to breathe a little easier, its silence now filled with the warmth of their presence. It was a fragile and unconventional bond, but for both of them, it was becoming the most real thing in their lives. One crisp autumn afternoon, Clara arrived at Arthur's house to find him in a state of quiet distress. He was standing in his living room, staring at a flickering overhead light, with a look of deep frustration on his face. "It's been doing that for a week," he said as she walked in. "I called an electrician 3 days ago. He said he'd be here. This morning he never showed up." Clara could hear the helplessness in his voice, the frustration of a man used to command, who was now at the mercy of a faulty wire and an unreliable repairman. "Let me take a look," she said, setting her bag down. Arthur looked at her with skepticism. "You know about wiring," Clara shrugged. "I know how to flip a circuit breaker and tighten a loose connection. My dad taught me a few things." She pulled a chair over and stood on it carefully. Unscrewing the glass cover of the light fixture as she poked around, she could feel Arthur's eyes on her. He was watching with a mixture of doubt and reluctant admiration. It was a simple fix, a loose wire that had jiggled free over time. She tightened it with a pair of pliers she found in a nearby drawer and screwed the cover back on. "Try it now," she said. Hopping down from the chair, Arthur flipped the switch and the light glowed steady and bright. He stared at it for a moment, then turned to her, a look of genuine surprise on his face. "How did you do that?" Clara laughed. "Sometimes the biggest problems have the simplest solutions," she said, wiping her hands on her jeans. He continued to stare at her, a strange expression on his face. It wasn't just gratitude, it was something deeper, something closer to awe. He had spent a lifetime paying people to solve his problems, hiring the best and the brightest to manage his empire, but this woman, this single mother with tired eyes and capable hands, had just walked into his life and fixed something broken with nothing more than common sense and a quiet determination. "You are a remarkable woman, Clara Vega," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Clara felt a blush creep up her neck. She wasn't used to praise, especially not from a man like Arthur. "I just tightened a wire," she said, deflecting his compliment. "No," he said, his gaze intense. "You do more than that. You show up." The words hung in the air between them, simple and profound. In that moment, their friendship shifted into something new, something that neither of them was prepared for. He saw her not as a waitress or a struggling single mother, but as a person of immense strength and integrity, and she saw him not as a lonely old man, but as someone who was learning to let the light back in the winter arrived with a quiet fury, blanketing the city in a thick layer of snow. The diner was slow, the streets were empty, and Clara found herself with a rare day off. She spent the morning with Leo building a lopsided snowman in the small park near their apartment, their laughter echoing in the cold, still air in the afternoon. She found herself thinking of Arthur. She imagined him alone in his big house watching the snow fall outside his window. She knew he wouldn't be able to get out, and she worried that he might not have enough food. She packed a thermos of hot chocolate and a bag of freshly baked ginger cookies and bundled Leo up for the short walk to Arthur's house. The streets were hushed and beautiful. The world transformed into a landscape of white and gray. When they arrived, Arthur's house was dark, except for the single lamp in the living room. Clara knocked, and after a moment he opened the door, a thick wool blanket wrapped around his shoulders. "Clara, Leo, what are you doing out in this?" he asked, his voice a mixture of surprise and concern. "We brought you provisions," Leo announced, holding up the cookies proudly. They stepped inside, shaking the snow from their boots. The house was colder than usual, and Clara noticed that the lights were off in the rest of the rooms. "Is your power out?" she asked. Arthur nodded. "It's been out for an hour. The whole block is dark," he said with a sigh. Clara's heart sank. She knew how vulnerable the elderly could be during a blackout. "Do you have a fireplace?" she asked. He led them into the living room, where a grand marble fireplace stood cold and empty. "I haven't used it in years," he said. "I wouldn't even know how to start it." Clara smiled. "Well, it's a good thing I do," she said, with a confidence she didn't quite feel. She had grown up in a house with a wood-burning stove and had learned from her father how to build a fire that would last through the night. She found a stack of old newspapers and some kindling in a brass bin beside the fireplace, and within minutes a small flame flickered to life. She carefully added larger logs until a warm, crackling fire blazed in the hearth, casting a golden glow across the room. The three of them sat on the floor in front of the fire, wrapped in blankets, sipping hot chocolate and eating cookies. The power outage had transformed the house. Stripping away its formal elegance and leaving behind a cozy intimacy, they told stories and played silly games with a deck of cards Clara had found in her pocket. The firelight danced on their faces, illuminating their smiles and chasing the shadows from the corners of the room. As the evening wore on, Leo fell asleep, his head in Clara's lap, his breathing soft, and even Clara and Arthur sat in a comfortable silence, watching the flames and listening to the wind howl outside. "You saved me again, Clara," Arthur said, his voice soft in the quiet room. Clara shook her head. "We're just keeping each other warm," she replied. He looked at her, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "It's more than that," he said. "You brought light into a place that has been dark for a very long time." In the warm, flickering glow of the fire, with the storm raging outside, they were no longer a waitress and a lonely old man. They were just two people who had found a small pocket of warmth and light in a cold and indifferent world, and for both of them it felt like coming home. The snowstorm raged for 2 days, shutting down the city and trapping them in a world of white and silence. Clara and Leo ended up staying at Arthur's house, a decision born of necessity that quickly transformed into something else entirely. The power remained out, but the fire in the hearth burned bright. A constant source of warmth and light, they lived by its rhythm. Rising when the sun cast a pale glow through the snow-covered windows, and settling in for the night when the flames dwindled to embers, they cooked simple meals over the fire, eggs and toast for breakfast, soup and grilled cheese for dinner. It was a far cry from the gourmet food Arthur could have had delivered, but it was food made with care and shared in a spirit of camaraderie that he hadn't experienced in decades. Leo was in his element. He treated the blackout like a grand adventure, building forts out of blankets and pillows and telling spooky stories in the dark. He and Arthur developed an even deeper bond, their shared confinement breeding a new level of familiarity. They spent hours playing chess on an old ivory set Arthur had unearthed from a dusty closet. Leo was a surprisingly adept player, and Arthur found himself genuinely challenged and delighted by the boy's quick mind. Clara watched them from a distance, a quiet smile on her face. She saw the way Arthur's eyes lit up when Leo made a clever move, the way he would explain a complex strategy with a patience she had never seen in him before. He was no longer the gruff, guarded man she had first met. He was becoming softer, more open, more human on the second night. As Leo slept soundly by the fire, Clara and Arthur sat talking, their voices low in the quiet room. "I haven't felt this alive in years," Arthur confessed, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "It's strange, isn't it?" Clara said. "How a storm can strip everything away and leave you with what really matters." He turned to her, his expression serious. "You and Leo, you're what matters, Clara." He reached out and took her hand, his fingers warm and dry against her skin. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Clara's heart fluttered at his touch, at the raw sincerity in his voice. She didn't pull her hand away. She simply let it rest in his, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had grown between them. In the darkness, surrounded by the storm, they had found a sanctuary, a small, fragile world of their own making. When the power finally came back on the following afternoon, the sudden burst of light and the hum of appliances felt like an intrusion. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world that was bright and clean and new. But something had shifted. Between them, the intimacy of their shared seclusion had forged a connection that could not be undone. They were no longer just friends. They were a family of sorts, a small, unconventional family brought together by a fall, a storm, and the calm, quiet magic of human connection. The first crack in their fragile world appeared on a Tuesday, a week after the storm. The city had returned to its normal rhythm. The snow had melted into slush, and the memory of the blackout had faded into a story to be told. Clara was at the diner, rushing through a busy lunch shift, when she overheard a conversation at one of her tables. Two men in expensive suits were talking about the recent fluctuations in the stock market. "Vance Industries is making a move," one of them said. "I hear old man Arthur is finally stepping back and the board is restructuring." Clara froze, a coffee pot hovering in her hand. Vance Industries. The name was vaguely familiar. A massive corporation with its fingers in everything from textiles to real estate. She had seen their logo on buildings all over the city, but she had never connected it to the quiet old man who lived in the brownstone. "I thought he was a recluse," the other man said. But his money isn't," the first man chuckled. "They say he's one of the richest men in the country, lives like a hermit but owns half the city." Clara's blood ran cold. She moved through the rest of her shift in the Rhine, a daze, the words echoing in her mind. One of the richest men in the country owns half the city. It couldn't be true. It had to be a different Arthur Vance, but deep down she knew it wasn't the immaculate house, the expensive but understated clothes, the way he had offered to pay her. That first night, it all clicked into place with a sickening thud. He wasn't just a lonely old man. He was a billionaire, a man of immense power and influence. And he had never told her. After work, she walked home in a bit fog, her mind reeling with the implications of her discovery. She felt a confusing mixture of emotions: shock, anger, and a profound sense of betrayal. He had let her bring him leftovers from the diner, let her fix his light, let her worry about him during the storm, all while he could have bought the entire city block without a second thought. She felt like a fool, a charity case, a naive woman who had been played by a man who was used to getting whatever he wanted. She didn't go to his house. That evening, she went straight home and locked the door behind her. She needed time to think, to process, to figure out what this meant for their friendship, for her, for Leo. When Leo asked why they weren't going to see Mr. Archie told him that she was tired, a flimsy excuse that didn't fool her perceptive son. "Is he mad at us?" Leo asked, his voice small and worried. "No, honey," Clara said, hugging him tightly. "Of course not." But as she held him, she couldn't shake the feeling that everything had changed, that the simple, honest connection they had built was based on a lie, and she didn't know if it could survive the truth. The silence from Clara was a palpable thing, a void that settled over Arthur's house and made it feel colder and emptier than it had before the storm. A day passed, then two, then a week. He told himself she was busy, that her life was demanding, and that he shouldn't expect her to drop everything for him. But he knew it was more than that. He had felt the shift in their last conversation, a new level of intimacy, and he had allowed himself to hope to believe that they were on the cusp of something real. Now there was just silence, he called the diner once. But the person who answered said Clara was on a break. He walked past her apartment building one evening, but the lights were off, and he felt like a fool for even trying. He replayed their conversations in his mind, searching for a clue, a reason for her sudden withdrawal. Had he said something wrong, done something to offend her? He couldn't think of anything. Their time together during the storm had been the happiest he had been in decades. He had felt a sense of belonging, a connection that he thought he had lost forever. He had even started to imagine a future that included her and Leo, a future that was filled with laughter and burnt grilled cheese and the quiet warmth of family. Now that future seemed to be slipping through his fingers like sand. He sat in his armchair, staring at the fire, that he now knew how to build a fire, that felt cold and mocking. Without her there to share its warmth, he missed her. He missed her quiet strength, her gentle kindness, her easy laughter. He missed the way she looked at him, not as a billionaire or a recluse, but as a man. He missed Leo's bright curiosity, his unfiltered honesty, his ability to see the world with a sense of wonder that Arthur had long since forgotten without them. His house was just a house again, a collection of expensive objects in a silent tomb. He had spent his life building a fortress to keep the world out, but now he realized that he had also trapped himself inside. Clara and Leo had been a breach in his defenses, a ray of light in his self-imposed darkness, and now that light was gone, he didn't know what to do. He had faced down corporate raiders and hostile takeovers, but he had no idea how to navigate the delicate landscape of a human heart. He had all the money in the world, but it couldn't buy him the one thing. He now realized he wanted more than anything, a second chance with the woman who had shown him what it meant to be truly alive. A month had passed. Since Clara had last seen Arthur, the city had moved on from the storm. The leaves had fallen from the trees, and a new kind of chill had settled in the air, a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Clara's life had returned to its familiar rhythm of work and worry, but the joy had been leached out of it. The diner felt more draining, the bills seemed more daunting, and the silence in her apartment, after Leo went to sleep, was heavier than ever. She missed Arthur more than she cared to admit. She missed their quiet conversations, his dry wit, the way his eyes would soften when he looked at Leo. She had tried to be angry at him for his deception, but the anger wouldn't stick. It was overshadowed by a deeper sadness, a sense of loss for the friendship she had cherished. One afternoon, as she was cleaning out a cluttered drawer, she came across a small folded piece of paper. It was a drawing Leo had made a few weeks ago, a crayon portrait of the three of them sitting in front of a crackling fire, their stick-figure faces beaming with happiness underneath. He had written in his wobbly handwriting, "My family." Clara's eyes filled with tears as she stared at the drawing. This was what Arthur's lie had cost them. Not just a friendship, but the hope of a Clarice Evantaman family. The hope of something more than just scraping by. She knew she had to talk to him, to tell him how she felt, to give him a chance to explain she had been hurt and betrayed. But she also knew that their connection had been real. You couldn't fake the kind of warmth and intimacy they had shared during the storm. She put on her coat and walked to his house, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and resolve. She didn't know what she would say or what would happen, but she knew she couldn't live with the silence anymore. She knocked on his door, her hand trembling, and waited. After a long moment, the door opened. Arthur stood there looking older and more tired than she had ever seen him. His eyes widened in surprise. When he saw her, Clara, he whispered her name like a prayer. "Can I come in?" she asked, her voice barely audible. He nodded wordlessly and stepped aside to let her in. The house was as clean and quiet as ever, but the air was thick with a palpable loneliness. They stood in the living room for a moment, the silence stretching between them like a chasm. Then Clara took a deep breath and pulled the drawing from her pocket. She unfolded it and held it out to him. "I think we need to talk," she said, her voice shaking. But clear, he took the drawing and stared at it, his eyes filling with a profound sadness. "I'm so sorry, Clara," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I never meant to deceive you." "Then why did you?" she asked, her own voice cracking. "Because I was afraid," he admitted, his gaze meeting hers. "I was afraid that if you knew who I was, you would see me as a checkbook, not a man I'm used to people wanting things from me. But you wanted nothing. You just gave." He looked down at the drawing again. "I was a fool to think I could keep it a secret. I was a fool to lose this." He gestured to the crayon figures. "To lose you." Clara's anger melted away, replaced by a deep wave of empathy. She understood his fear, his loneliness, his desire to be seen for who he was, not what he had. "I was scared too," she confessed. "I was scared of being a charity case, a project for a rich man to fix." They stood there in the quiet room, their hearts laid bare, their vulnerabilities exposed. The chasm between them was still there, but it was no longer insurmountable. It was a space that could be bridged with honesty and forgiveness, and the shared hope of rebuilding the family that a small boy had already seen. So clearly, the conversation that followed was long and honest, a painful but necessary unraveling of the lies and fears that had separated them. Clara spoke of her, hurt her feeling of betrayal, of being made to feel small and foolish. Arthur listened without interruption, his eyes never leaving her face when she was done. He told her his own story, a story of a life so insulated by wealth that it had become a prison. He spoke of his deep-seated fear of being valued only for his money, a fear that had driven him into a self-imposed exile. He admitted that he had been a coward for not telling her the truth, but that his prevented fear of losing the one real connection he had made in decades had been greater than his courage. "I don't expect you to forgive me, Clara," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "But I want you to know that my feelings for you and for Leo were the most honest thing I have felt in my life." Clara looked at him and saw, not a billionaire, not a powerful tycoon, but a lonely man who was desperate for a human connection, a man who had made a mistake out of fear, not malice her own. Heart softened with a forgiveness. She hadn't known she was capable of. "I believe you, Arthur," she said softly. "But I don't know where we go from here." The gap between their worlds was vast, a chasm of wealth, class, and experience that seemed impossible to bridge. "I don't want to change who you are, Clara," he said, his voice earnest. "I don't want to fix your life. I just want to be a part of it." He proposed a solution, a way to bridge the rind, is ex-stadio, gap without erasing it. He offered to set up a trust for Leo, a fund for his education that would give him the opportunities Arthur had never had. But he made it clear that it was a gift with no strings attached. It was not a payment for Clara's friendship or a way to buy his way into their lives. It was simply a gesture of love for the boy who had brought so much joy into his own life. Clara was hesitant at first, her pride still a formidable barrier, but when she looked into Arthur's eyes, she saw no pity, no condescension, only a genuine desire to do something good. She thought of Leo's future, the endless struggle she faced to provide for him, and she realized that accepting Arthur's gift was not an act of charity, but an act of love for her son. It was a new beginning for all of them, a tentative step onto a bridge that spanned the chasm between their two worlds. They didn't know what the future held, but they knew they would face it together, their unconventional family, forged in the fires of a storm, and tempered by the grace of forgiveness. The months that followed were a period of gentle integration, a slow and careful weaving together of two disparate worlds. Arthur became a regular presence in Clara and Ford, Leo's lives. He would show up at the diner for lunch, sitting at a corner booth and ordering the soup of the day with a quiet smile. At first, the regulars were curious, their whispers and glances following him like a shadow, but Clara's easy and genuine affection for him soon quelled their speculation. They saw him not as the reclusive billionaire from the headlines, but as Clara's friend, a kind old man who doted on her son Arthur, in turn, began to emerge from his self-imposed exile. He started taking walks in the park where he would watch Leo play on the swings, his face softening with a grandfatherly pride. He had never known he invited Clara and Leo to his house for dinner, not to the formal dining room that had sat unused for years, but to the small kitchen table where they would eat simple meals and talk for hours. He taught Leo how to play the piano on the grand instrument that had been silent for decades, its keys now coming alive with the hesitant notes of a child's song. Clara's life began to change too, not because of Arthur's money, but because of his presence with the blank burden of Leo's future lifted by the educational trust. She found herself with a new sense of freedom and possibility. She started dreaming again of her bakery, of a life beyond the diner and its endless cycle of work and exhaustion. Arthur encouraged her dreams. He listened to her ideas with a keen business sense, offering advice and support without ever trying to take control. He helped her draw up a business plan, research locations, and navigate the complex world of permits and licenses. He was not just a friend, he was a mentor, a partner, a believer in her potential. Their relationship deepened into something that defied easy labels. It was more than friendship, but it wasn't a conventional romance, it was a deep bond built on mutual respect, shared vulnerability, and a deep and abiding love. They were two lonely souls who had found in each other a sense of home, a place where they could be their true selves without fear or pretense. Their family was not one of blood, but of choice, a small constellation of three disparate stars that had found their way into the same orbit, creating a light that was warmer and brighter than any of them could have created alone. It was a quiet revolution, a bloody, gentle remaking of their world. One day at a time, the bakery was a dream made real, a small jewel box of a shop on a sun-drenched corner of a quiet street. The air inside smelled of cinnamon and yeast and melting butter. The walls were painted a warm, buttery yellow, and the display cases were filled with a tempting array of pastries and breads. Each one, a testament to Clara's skill and passion. She had named it the Rising Loaf, a nod to both her craft and her own journey. From the ashes of a broken life, the grand opening was a modest affair, a simple gathering of friends and neighbors who had come to celebrate Clara's success. The shop was filled with the sound of laughter and the clinking of coffee cups, a warm and welcoming hub of community life. Leo stood behind the counter, a small apron tied around his waist, his face beaming with pride as he handed out free cookies to the customers. He was the official taste tester, a role he took very seriously. Arthur stood by the window, a quiet observer, his eyes shining with an emotion that was too deep for words. He watched Clara as she moved through the crowd, greeting each person with a warm smile and a genuine hug. She was no longer the tired waitress with weary eyes. She was a confident and radiant business owner, a woman who had found her calling and her place in the world. A local reporter came by to do a story on the new shop, and he asked Clara about her inspiration. She looked over at Arthur, and her eyes softened. "I was inspired by someone who taught me that it's never too late to start over," she said, her voice filled with a quiet gratitude. The reporter turned to Arthur, his pen poised. "And what about you, Mr. Vance? What's your connection to the Rising Loaf?" Arthur smiled, a rare and beautiful smile that transformed his face. "I'm just a friend," he said, "a very proud friend." He didn't mention the fact that he had anonymously provided the seed money for the bakery. A gift he had given with no expectation of return. He didn't need the credit or the recognition. His reward was seeing the joy on Clara's face, the light in her eyes, the fulfillment of a dream that had once seemed impossible. Later that day, after the last customer had left, and the shop was quiet, Clara, Arthur, and Leo sat at a small table by the window, sharing a slice of warm apple pie. The setting sun cast a golden glow across the room, illuminating the port. Dust motes dancing in the air. They were a picture of quiet contentment, a family born not of obligation but of love. "I couldn't have done this without you, Arthur," Clara said, her hand resting on his. "Yes, you could have," he replied, his voice gentle but firm. "It just might have taken a little longer." They looked at each other, and in that shared glance was a world of unspoken understanding, a deep and abiding connection that had weathered storms and bridged divides. They had found in each other not a solution to their problems, but a partner in their journey, a companion for the road ahead. The future was an unwritten page, but for the first time in a long time it was a page filled with promise and possibility. The Journey SD Sage Bakery flourished, becoming a beloved neighborhood institution. Clara's days were long and filled with hard work, but it was a joyful labor, a stark contrast to the soul-crushing exhaustion of the diner. She hired a small staff, creating jobs for other people in the community, and her shop became a gathering place, a hub of warmth and connection. Arthur was a constant presence, a silent partner who offered his wisdom and support without ever overstepping. He would spend his afternoons at a small table by the window, a cup of tea in his hand, reading the newspaper and watching the gentle rhythm of the bakery's life. He became a grandfather figure to Leo, teaching him about business and life and the importance of integrity. They would spend hours talking, their heads bent together in serious conversation. Their bond, a source of deep and abiding joy for both of them. One sunny afternoon, as they were sitting in the bakery, Arthur turned to Clara with a serious expression on his face. "I've been thinking about the future, Clara," he said, his voice low. "My future." Clara's heart skipped a beat. She knew that Arthur was not a young man, and the thought of a future without him was a painful one. "I'm rewriting my will," he continued, "and I want to leave everything to you and Leo." Clara was stunned. She opened her mouth to protest, but he held up a hand to stop her. "It's not about the money, Clara," he said, his gaze intense. "It's about legacy. I spent my life building an empire of things, but you've built a life of substance, of community, of love. That's the legacy I want to leave behind." Clara was moved to tears by his words, his trust in her, his belief in the life she had created. She knew that he was not just giving her his fortune, he was giving her his heart, his legacy, his final and most profound gift. Years passed, and the rising loaf became a small empire of its own, with several locations throughout the city, each one a beacon of warmth and community. Clara became a successful and respected businesswoman, but she never lost the humility and kindness that had defined to her. She used her success to help others, creating a foundation that provided grants to aspiring entrepreneurs and support to single mothers. Arthur lived to see Leo graduate from college, his face beaming with pride at the ceremony he passed away peacefully in his sleep a few years later, leaving behind a legacy of love and generosity that touched countless lives. Clara and Leo continued to honor his memory, using the fortune he had left them to make the world a better place. One loaf of bread, one act of kindness at a time. One evening, Clara was sitting in the original bakery long after closing time. The shop was quiet, the air filled with the familiar scent of yeast and sugar. She was looking at an old photograph, a blank picture of the three of them, Arthur, Clara, and a young Leo, their faces lit by the glow of a fireplace during a snowstorm so many years ago. Leo, now a grown man with a kind smile that mirrored his mother's, walked in and sat down beside her. He put his arm around her shoulders, and they sat in a comfortable silence for a moment. "I was just thinking about him," Clara said, her voice soft with memory. Me too, Leo replied. He taught me so much. He taught us all so much, Clara said. Tear rolling down her cheek, she looked around the bakery at the warm and welcoming space. She had built a space that was a testament to the power of kindness and the enduring strength of the human heart. She had come so far from the tired waitress, struggling to make ends meet. She had found love, success, and a sense of purpose she had never thought possible. And it had all started with a simple act of kindness. On a rainy evening, a small gesture that had changed the course of 3 lives forever. She smiled through her tears, a smile of gratitude and love for the man who had shown her that even in the darkest of storms, there is always the possibility of light.